Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth in our five-part panel discussion series addressing some of the fundamental issues and opportunities of Canada's EV charging infrastructure. I'm Nino Di Cara, the founder of Electric Autonomy Canada, and I'm delighted to introduce this episode, Democratizing EV Charging, which is sponsored by Flow. From home stations to commercial sites to entire fleet conversions, Flow delivers comprehensive charging solutions from hardware and software to ongoing network support and driver applications. Flow's products are simple to use, convenient and reliable, boasting a network performance of over 98%. We're grateful to Flow EV Charging for their support of this discussion today. Whether a driver is able-bodied or has special mobility needs, or if they live in a rural, remote or urban community, and whether they drive a luxury or a mainstream model, what steps are being taken to ensure the public EV charging experience in Canada is accessible, equitable, and consistent? I'm very grateful to the experts who've committed their time to speak with us today and to share their thoughts on how we can get this right. I'm pleased to introduce you to them now. They are Margarita Pacis, Policy Analyst at the City of Vancouver; David Paterson, Vice President Corporate and Environmental Affairs at General Motors; Frye, Senior Policy Advisor at Natural Resources Canada; Elizabeth France, Senior Legal and Public Affairs Director at Flow EV Charging; and my colleague, Emma Jarratt, Managing Editor of Electric Autonomy Canada, who will be moderating the discussion today. So with that, over to you, Emma.
Thanks, Nino. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to have you all here. And this is exciting. We don't usually get to rope in so many West Coast panelists in one group. So that's nice to have that representation. So I'd like to start by asking you all, when I say democratizing EV charging, it's a really big topic. What comes to your mind first when you hear that? David, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, and thanks, Emma. I mean, this topic's so important to us at General Motors, and in fact, the best way for me to illustrate it's on my water cup, which says "Everybody in," and that's very much the way that we're looking at charging and just at the bringing forward of electric vehicles. We want everybody to have access to electric vehicles and to charging, and we want it to be accessible. We want it to be properly maintained, practical, and really think deeply about equity in terms of how to do that as we go forward. So that's what comes to mind for me.
Great. Elizabeth?
Thanks, Emma. Similar to what David said at Flow, we really see democratizing EVs being about equity and really ensuring that the benefits associated with EVs and electrification are available to everyone. And in particular, that underserved communities or groups are considered in that transition. And so from a charging infrastructure perspective, we like to think about it in two ways. Really, first, ensuring that charging stations are deployed in an equitable manner, meaning that they're available for everyone, even in locations that may be more remote or where utilization rates may be a bit lower and less economical at first, but and also to provide public charging alternatives for those who can't easily charge at home. So the focus on options for those without single family homes is also crucial to us. But at another level, we think it's really important, and we think about operating and maintaining assets in an equitable manner. So we think about that as meaning that even if charging stations are in the ground, they're serviced and actually working for drivers in all areas. Because while it's important to get dots on the map, we need to really ensure that stations work reliably for all of the users.
Thanks. Chris?
Well, our panelists are hitting all the right notes, I think, so far. I mean, it is a great big topic. When I first saw the description of what you were hoping to cover in 60 minutes today, I thought this is going to be a very exciting panel, and I look forward to talking about all these things. So agree with the federal government, with Natural Resources Canada. Equity is a big point that we're looking at. EV charging across the areas that Dave and Elizabeth have mentioned. We're also very interested in terms of charging, the fairness in terms of payment at stations, whether it's paying for, Measurement Canada at our end, at the federal government's working hard on finally advancing payment for electrons rather than payment for time. That's a big area of equity that we can talk about more through the panel today. We're also really interested in access to the vehicles as well. I think David and Elizabeth both alluded to this, and what underserved communities in Canada people who may never own a vehicle, but still we want to see access to zero emission mobility is a really big area for us in terms of equity. And then the people who work on these charging stations and on the vehicles, the just transition of the workforce that will support zero emission mobility going forward is really important to the federal government. So those are some of the areas, and lots to say on all these topics as we go forward throughout the discussion. But thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Chris. And Marga.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree with everything that's already been said. I can provide a bit more insight and a bit of thoughts from a City of Vancouver perspective. I really do think a democratic approach to EV charging would consider, all current and potential EV users. And I think it would take a very human-centered design approach. So we're delivering what our residents actually really want to need. Here in Vancouver, we know that access to charging is a major deciding factor, of course, for folks considering an EV. And in 2020, a survey that we launched showed us that 59% of residents who are interested in buying interested in buying a car in the next 2 years, but were not getting an EV, felt that access to charging was their biggest barrier. So, there are issues with accessing charging in Vancouver. And we do know that certain demographics have a harder time accessing charging. So maybe that's folks with mobility issues. In Vancouver, we currently don't have a lot or maybe any accessible charging. And anyone without home charging who might live in public charging deserts might also have trouble accessing. In Vancouver, 57% of residents don't have access to home charging right now. So those are a few issues and topics that come to mind. And for sure, the City of Vancouver is actively working to address those issues, but looking forward to chatting more about this in this discussion.
Thanks. So Chris, picking up on what Margaret was saying, what people want and need. Obviously, we know that NRCan does do public surveys and outreach to understand what the public opinion is around EVs and charging. So could you share with us the latest findings from those polls, please?
I can share some things. Yeah, we did a pretty vast amount of research in 2021, but we have some new data coming in for 2022. I can share a little bit. We're not the only group doing at the federal government level doing research. So folks may see different things published that are coming right out of the Privy Council office and from different parts of NRCan. Also, Measurement Canada they're doing all kinds of consultation and engagement around charging by energy rather than, actually moving to that point. So there's lots of engagement, lots of public opinion research going on. I can tell you a few things, and actually some interesting things that we've just become aware of from outside of even Canada, but that are really pertinent, I think, for this discussion around EV charging and accessibility, et cetera. So, this year we found some really good news in terms of just interest and exposure to EVs. The group I'm with does a lot of work actually on awareness and education. And so we're very interested in what people know and what their intents are and their perceptions. Perception is really the key thing, around any of this stuff. So let me see, I'll just rattle off a couple things. So up by 8 percentage points, 54% of Canadians now say they know someone who owns a zero emission vehicle. And we call them zero emission vehicles because we like to include hydrogen fuel cell vehicles as well. But I know we're primarily talking about EVs here. Interestingly, this is like a positive number for us, but still a low number. Just about 40% say they have either ridden in or driven a zero emission vehicle, an EV. So it still means 60% of Canadians have not. And that's kind of an exposure that we just want to keep trying to improve. But that's up 7 points from last year. So it's, just under 2/3, just under a third last year that said they'd even never been in one of these vehicles. So that's the kind of thing. And it varies quite a bit across the country. Atlantic Canada, only just about a quarter of people say they've ever even been in one of these vehicles, whereas in BC, it's over 50%. So these are kind of like some of the interesting stats. The EV charging, still really a bare majority say there are too few. Around 55% say there are too few, if any, publicly available charging stations where they drive. So that's not a good number. That's the kind of thing that we really need to work on. But some other like sort of real challenges that we need to work on in terms of what's perceived and what's available. 70% of people still say they're too expensive. These vehicles are just simply too expensive. Only 25% agree that the style or type of vehicle they'd like for their lifestyle is available. Like they don't see that there's a vehicle out there for them at all. And then when you combine that affordability and the lifestyle, this is really one of those telling stats. Only 17%, that's 17%, agree that there's an affordable EV that meets their lifestyle needs. So that's not very many. That's like a very vast majority saying we don't even see that there's something here that I can afford and do what I want it to do. However, there like I say, there are some positive things. Another one that was interesting, we started asking some questions around sort of the greater market forces at play. And 57% of people responded that they would be less likely to buy an EV if there were a 12-month or longer wait to get their hands on one of these vehicles. So this is like sort of saying, if there is a constraint around how I can access one of those vehicles, and we saw the number, like it tailed off dramatically as you went for a 3-month, 6-month, 12-month kind of wait time. Now, that'll probably be the same for any type of vehicle. That's maybe not EV specific, but they're saying, wait times would be big for us. Last thing I want to throw in here is, and we can talk more about this, is a new study that we've been made aware of from our colleagues, our friends at the University of California, Davis. Many folks may be aware of their Institute for Transportation Studies, and they do like really great work down there. University of California, Davis has done a lot of research. They have an interesting new study from 2022 about perceptions of EV charging and availability, and that's the impact on whether someone is considering purchasing an EV. And so I'm going to read this because I don't want to get it wrong, just like the main kind of conclusion of the findings. They say there's no evidence of a relationship between public charging station location density and participants reporting that they see EV charging locations. So they've done this overlay of mapping and they've done surveys. So they're like, this is how dense the chargers are in this area. There's no difference when people saying, I see more or I see less or fewer chargers compared to a place where there actually are more or less chargers. So that was interesting. Nor is there a relationship between public charging location density and EV purchase consideration. So this is like what UC Davis is telling us from their latest study. And I mean, I can add the link and people can go read. This is just one study. This is one piece of information that we find interesting because we're trying to learn all the time about what perception versus reality is for folks. Maybe the last thing I'll say on that is that we do have a behavioral scientist who's joined our team at NRCan, who's really digging into all this stuff and helping us learn where we can make better investments in awareness and education related to charging. And she lives in Toronto. She lives in a very densely populated area of Toronto. When she joined the team in February, she told us just outright, there are no charging stations in my neighborhood. She just said they don't exist. And so we sent her our station locator map. And the next day she said, there are in fact 15 charging stations like within a 2-block radius of where I live. I had no idea. I am not interested in, and that's kind of the findings of the study from California Davis, is they're saying pre-interest in EVs helps people see chargers. And then they know there are chargers in the neighborhood, and that makes that, but it's not the other way around. It's not that chargers help you get interested in an EV or up your consideration level. It's actually the other way around. So I'm not sure if I articulated that well, but that's some stuff from findings we're interested in and findings of our own recently. I hope that answers the question to some degree. Emma, and I'm sorry for going on so long, my panelist colleagues.
No, it absolutely does answer the question. And, I'd love to follow that up, Elizabeth, with, totally point taken about pre-interest in EVs, making things about them like charging stations more noticeable to people. But then I think there's also kind of this almost preconceived notion when you get over that hurdle of, all right, I'm going to get the EV, I have mine, I'm at the charging station. At least with me, it was like kind of expecting it to be a little bit like a gas station. It's not that much different. You just take the little hose and you plug it into your car. It's electricity, not gas. But it's actually not, because we have different billing for the EV chargers. So, I would love to hear about how you view the recent changes and upgrades to allow billing by kilowatt hour to mimic that gas station experience, which is something we talked about a lot yesterday in our panel, how that's an important piece of consumer psychology.
Absolutely. I'm excited to talk about exciting metrology news. There's not always exciting metrology news in the EV space, but there is right now. So maybe I can give the listeners just a sense of what's happened and what our take on that is, Emma, if that's helpful. Measurement Canada has recently released a temporary dispensation for level 2 chargers in Canada, and is also currently working on a specification for fast chargers. So that's what Chris was alluding to in terms of all of the work that they're doing. And the first question people ask is like, what is a temporary dispensation? Like, what does this mean? And in essence, it means that for the first time in Canada, drivers can be billed for charging their electric vehicles on the basis of kilowatt hour supplied by a charging station, as opposed to only on the basis of like time or session. And so the next question people ask is like, well, why does that matter? And so as many of you know, when it comes to charging an EV, not all EVs draw the same amount of power when they charge. And so, for example, like newer or higher end vehicles may draw more power than an older or lower end model. And this is particularly important for fast charging, especially when vehicles become, capable of accepting faster chargers. However, in pre-temporary dispensation land, when both vehicles are being charged on the basis of time, the driver of the older vehicle is actually paying more because it takes longer for them to charge their vehicle than it does to charge the new model. So when drivers are allowed to be billed on the basis of kilowatt hours, vehicles that draw the same amount of power end up paying the same to charge their vehicles, which is perceived by many drivers as a fairer way or a more equitable way of billing. And so back to your question, Emma, in the sense, just like gas, the amount of energy is what is being used to power the vehicle. And so drivers can now pay for that as opposed to only paying on the basis of time. And so what does this mean for our industry? I mean, at Flow, we strongly support the development of transparent billing and metrology rules in Canada and other jurisdictions. And we're really pleased to see progress in this area because we know it's something that our users want. That being said, does that mean that everybody is immediately going to shift to kilowatt hour billing for level 2s and fast chargers when it becomes available? Probably not, is our assessment. In some cases, like I said, EV charging is similar to dispensing fuel. It's about the energy dispensed. But in other cases, it's really about encouraging people to efficiently turn over from their charging station when they're done using it. And so one of the differences between the gas station and the EV charging model is when you're at a gas station, once your vehicle is fueled, you move on because your vehicle is full and there's really nothing else to do there. However, as we know, EV charging stations are becoming ubiquitous. They're located in many different locations and many of which are actually parking stalls. And so here there may be a need to encourage drivers to sort of free the spot once their battery is charged, which is not something that exists, when you pull up to fuel up at a gas station. So overall, the increased flexibility for how drivers can be billed is great news, but we probably will see a range of billing models being available to users that include time, energy, and hybrid models that will still encourage that turnover because of the differences in EV charging and gas fueling.
Thanks. So, sorry, Chris, go ahead. Yes.
I'm really sorry. Thanks so much for all that, Elizabeth. There is the discussion and the consultation on the level 3 charging moving into a temporary dispensation is actually live now until December 9th. So I don't seem to be able to put links into the chat. I don't think that everybody who's viewing can see, but I'll give you guys the link. And so folks, we would highly encourage everybody to go out and, provide their 2 bits to Measurement Canada about that temporary dispensation for fast chargers, which is where I think this stuff really matters even more when more electrons are being delivered. So just wanted to put that out there.
No, thanks, Chris. That's great. That's very helpful information, I think, for everyone who wants to weigh in. So moving to a smaller or more localized level, I guess. Marga, BC, if not Vancouver itself, is sort of viewed as the leader in EV adoption in Canada. It's where things tend to happen first here. So what strategies has Vancouver City been using to ensure EV drivers get consistent, equitable experience that are effective? And I'd be interested to know, particularly in low-income areas, what those strategies look like.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that question. So Vancouver has been implementing EV policies for quite a while now. So I think that's why we're viewed as quite a leader. I can share some highlights of that because there's a lot there. So bear with me. I'm probably going to share like little bits of a lot of things that Vancouver's done and try not to take up too much time. But one of the main things is that all new buildings have to be EV ready. So we know home charging is important. So for residential, whether it's rental or strata, the buildings have to be 100% EV ready, and I think that's been since 2018. And then earlier this year, council passed a policy where non-residential buildings also have to be, so new non-residential buildings have to be 45% EV ready, and that includes the accessible stalls. So we're starting to future-proof accessibility and accessible stalls as well. So that supports the consistent network in Vancouver. On the home charging side, Vancouver also has a cord cover license program so that people can now safely charge at home if they're parked on the street. And there's just, it's safer in the public realm if you have the cords going across the sidewalk and things like that. Very exciting. We also have a rental retrofit program, which I think kicked off this year or last year. We have so many renters in Vancouver, 50% about of Vancouverites are renters, and they don't necessarily get to make decisions about adding charging to their rental buildings. And many of them live in apartments, usually older buildings or basement suites. So they might not have access to home charging, and we know it's important. So we're trying to help rental building owners install charging there. And then on the public side of things, DC fast chargers are now only a 10-minute drive apart from each other. And that 10 minutes was a time that we got based on public feedback. So that's what the residents, it was popular with the residents. So this program really fills gaps. It helps with consistency. And we did focus on underserved neighborhoods, high density areas with high proportions of renters. So we tried to make it as human-centered as possible in the design. This is also exciting in terms of physical accessibility. We're working on design guidelines for accessible charging. So these haven't been created yet, but we know, so the city does have a lot of policies in place to increase EV charging, a lot of the policies I'm talking about. And we're also installing charging that we own to grow the public network, but we don't have any guidance or mandate around accessibility. And I don't know if there are any accessible chargers in Vancouver right now. So there's already a barrier for people with disabilities that want to shift to an EV today. Charging could be a challenge for them. And as we kind of increase that shift to EVs, we really need to make sure that people with disabilities aren't left behind. We also know that improving accessibility and designing for accessibility can help everyone at some point in their lives. So we're trying to use principles of universal design as much as possible. Knowing that designing inclusively from the start, from the outset, can prevent costs associated with retrofits, which can be expensive in the future. So these guidelines will only apply to city-owned chargers to start. And what we have jurisdiction over, of course, is the space, like the way the stall is designed, how we orient the charger. But we're also hoping to work with some of those charging providers to get the charge station itself to be more accessible to suit our needs as well. And then finally, this year, City Council passed a motion to encourage EV charging at gas stations and at larger commercial parking lots. So that should help round out the network as well. So I've mentioned a lot of things here. I'd be happy to provide more info on any of the things that I mentioned if people want.
Thanks. So David, we've heard a lot of policy side on this from government, from the charging networks and how government's influencing them. OEMs exist involved in this, but a bit standalone in a way, because you have a bit more control over charging, because you have large properties, dealerships across Canada. So I would love to hear what GM's dealerships are doing to take responsibility for furthering equitable public charging access. If you've heard anything from the other panelists that you think GM could jump onto and leverage.
No, thanks, Emma. First of all, I just building on Marga's comments, and two, I always say Canada needs more, or the world needs more Canada, and Canada needs more Vancouver, because what's happening in Vancouver is a great blueprint for other urban areas, and there's some great learnings. We may, where we're shoveling snow, some of the things that that Vancouver does in crossing sidewalks might have to think about differently. And to Chris too, I mean, Canada and Enercan in particular is really doing amazing things to support all of this across Canada. But it's going to take all of us to do that. Chris can't be expected to deliver the entire charging network. But our intention at General Motors is to be fully battery electric in the entire light-duty fleet by 2035. So for us, we need to bring our customers along. And that means we need to be involved in charging. So we're doing three things right now that I think are important for us because we want our customers to follow and to buy electric vehicles. Number one are Chevrolet and Cadillac electric vehicles that are in the market right now. We have programs so that we'll pay for your home charging. We know most charging is done at home or at work, and so helping people to install a charger at home is going to take away one of those barriers on charging. So that's probably the biggest first step that's important to take, and we're helping facilitate that for our customers. Second thing is we have dealers all across Canada. The first thing you see when you drive into many communities is a car dealership, and so they know their communities. And so what we have right across North America right now is a program from General Motors to install 40,000 level 2 chargers that are community chargers. And what we're doing is building them around our dealerships. So we have some 400 plus in Canada, coast to coast in all communities. And they are working with their communities and other partners, including NGOs that also work with Chris's department to help us to make sure that around the dealerships in particular, that if someone's living in a MURB or somebody doesn't have access to street charging, we can help to point that out as to where they are. And we can also help them with apps and all kinds of technology that is now emerging to help people to the earlier example, know where are the chargers. And so that's really important. And then thirdly, and this primarily so far in the United States, we're working with groups like US Pilot and Flying J to build charging stations on highways. And this is one of the things that Chris's research and others really points out to us, is that fear of, okay, I can use an electric vehicle in my city, but what if I've got to drive somewhere else and I need that ability to charge? And so we are looking at what we can do in that regard to try and build out Canada's highway systems with level 3 charging, and that gets into some of the issues that Elizabeth was bringing up in terms of how important it is to have a regulatory environment to make sure that we can build these chargers. Elizabeth would know better than me, but it's about $100,000 to put a level 3 charger into the ground. And then on top of that, you have all the billing issues that we mentioned in terms of Measurement Canada. And then with the provinces and the electric utilities, you also have standby charges that you're going to need to be able to pay to make sure that charger is accessible 24/7. Let alone maintained properly, like good companies like Flow do. And so all of these things are of deep interest to us. And the bottom line is that we won't get people into electric vehicles unless we're EV ready. And EV readiness means all three of those levels of charging at home, in our cities, but also on our highways for road trips. And we're trying to make a difference in all those areas, but it's going to take a village.
So David, I just want to knit in an audience question because it's very relevant to what you're chatting about. Is GM considering on any of the chargers that they're building drive-through stalls? This audience member has said, speaking to lifestyle, we frequently tow a trailer. The pull-in charging stalls don't allow for charging while connected with a trailer without blocking access for others.
Yeah, absolutely. I think earlier we talked a little bit of design thinking around how to make this work for customers. And, this would never be any of Elizabeth's chargers, but, very often people will say, yes, there's a charger, but it's beside a dump somewhere, a dumpster somewhere, and it's out of it's not working or something like that. And those are the types of disappointing experiences that can turn people off. We're also finding that with our customers, when they go electric in our GM electrics, they tend to stay and they love it. They love the experience. The one thing that really we find gets people to give up their electric car and go back is charging infrastructure. And so that's really, really important to make this stick and to make it work in that regard. So, we are designing sort of the charging stations of the future that are very customer friendly. If you're going to have to spend a little bit more time charging than you would filling up a tank of gasoline, it needs to be a good experience. And I love the question about, if I'm towing, because we are going to see in the next year or two, we'll have our fully electric pickup trucks out. And those are things that do real work. They pull boats, they pull trailers. And so you need to make sure that you can have a charging experience that is designed to service that too. So it's in our direct interest as being, the pickup truck leaders, and to make sure that as we bring our electric pickup trucks, SUVs, the vehicles that people actually want to buy for their family needs and whatever, as they go electric, we have to make sure that those thoughts are in place as well. So again, we'll do everything we can in this preparation, but it's going to take everybody working together to make sure that we get that type of infrastructure in place. Biggest change since we left horses, so let's do it right.
Thanks. So, Elizabeth, I wanted to follow up on David's point about flow and how it's decided where chargers will go in. So, how does Flow do those consultations with site hosts to ensure that there is democratic access to EV chargers there, preferably not beside a dumpster? And, they have sufficient charging speeds, they're reliable, and they are physically accessible.
Yeah, great question, Emma. And, I can maybe touch on the accessibility point a little bit. And Chris, I know you guys have been thinking about this as well. So obviously feel free to jump in. But, one of the most interesting, aspects of being in this industry is that standards and rules are constantly changing, and they're constantly changing for the better, sort of as this industry that is still new becomes more mature. And so as we talked about, and as all of the panelists have mentioned, it's not just about getting charging stations in the ground anymore. It's making sure that they meet the needs of all drivers, including making the stations more accessible. And so we know that in the US, they have a much more developed, accessibility standards through the Americans with Disabilities Act than we have in Canada. And we've even seen the development of sort of specific accessibility rules related to EV charging. So for example, in the California Building Code, and more recently in the design recommendations for accessible electric vehicle charging stations released by the U.S. Access Board. So we're starting to get lots of guidelines of how we can do better and how we can make stations more accessible. And from the charging infrastructure perspective, we're really supportive of these requirements. We're constantly monitoring the developments, and they certainly, as Margo was also saying, they certainly influence our charging station designs and the work that's being done for our team. As Margo mentioned, there's so many different aspects to accessibility, from the charging hardware to the placement of the station to the markings that are on the parking spot, to making sure that the station, the spaces are wide enough. And just as David said, it's going to take everybody's collaboration to make sure that works, from the provider of the charging stations that provide stations that are, low enough to use for somebody that might be in a wheelchair, that have, reach ranges that are acceptable, that have, holsters in the right spots and the right locations, that aren't too heavy for users when they're accessing the connector. So from the hardware level to the installer level, to the placement of the station and that sort of thing. So I can assure you that this is an area that we, and I particularly look at closely. We're always wondering how we can do better. And it's always better to have designs that are implemented at the beginning rather than retrofitting at the end. We see that time and time again, from, chargers to many different things. So we're certainly looking at that, because it's important to have, access to charging for everybody. The second piece I'll maybe mention on this, when we're working with clients, is like the rural charging issue, Emma. And you know, as David said, like we need to make Canadians feel comfortable that they can charge wherever they live, and that's including those in rural areas. And we're seeing the development of many new EV models. You know, the electric pickup trucks that are coming that we know that will sort of appeal to those rural areas. And really the challenge with those areas is that utilization rates are often lower at the beginning. And so this is an area where, you know, there's a huge need for government support, and Chris's team, you know, is hugely influential through the NRCan ZEVIT program that helps to get stations into those areas where there's just not always an obvious business case, and also the recent funding through the Canadian Infrastructure Bank for the charging and hydrogen refueling infrastructure initiative. It's a great initiative, and it's so key to helping assets be deployed in those more remote and rural areas where, you know, there still remains a utilization gap. But as we know, people need to feel confident to adopt EVs and to see, you know, some of those EV chargers in the ground in order to adopt. So let me stop there and see if I answered some of your questions.
No, definitely. And we actually had an audience question on this exact topic that I'll put to you right now. How do we manage the trade-off when economics alone don't support the cost of installing and maintaining chargers in remote areas?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is the government support is imperative. We need to, you know, and someone else touched on this earlier. I think it was David, like there are so many costs in putting in charging stations. And so one of the things that we try to work with our customers on is, you know, do you need a level 2 station? Do you need a fast charging station? Like what are the needs? And people have talked about this before, but right sizing, making sure that not everybody needs a fast charger. Not everybody needs to put in, you know, a really expensive unit. It depends on the business case, the use case, and what you're aiming to achieve. But in areas where the business case remains challenging, it's really having the support of government to help bring those areas that are just less populated along in the transition, making those residents feel like they can have the confidence to drive an EV, you know, whether it's for work, whether it's for seeing family members in the area, whether it's encouraging tourism in those areas. You know, I think the short answer is we really need government support in those areas until we can reach the utilization levels where we need to make it a more sustainable option.
Chris, would love to get your thoughts on all of that.
Well, I mean, I don't know if if you guys think I'm paying Elizabeth, you know, off the side. That's great promotion for government, what the federal government's working on. And to her point and to David's point, you know, there has to be work at all these different levels. And so we are committed to the ZEVIC, the zero emission vehicle infrastructure program does have, you know, we've been recapitalized again with $400 million more dollars. And our focus really is on making sure that underserved areas, both, you know, remote and rural areas, but also multi-unit residential buildings, those kind of charging opportunities are funded through this federal program. Last year, there was also a call for third-party delivery agents to make sure that smaller project types could also access funds, which is really, really important, again, for getting equitable access to charging opportunities. So not everything's going to be a giant mega project with lots of chargers. They're going to be small communities in small areas. On the other hand, this Canada Infrastructure Bank funding, which is $500 million announced recently, for a totally different model. It's for financing, you know, large projects, over $10 million projects, but with really favorable lending terms. I would say that there's a bunch of information that they have about, and people can go. I'll share that link as well about that program. But it's for, you know, if you want to do a massive project, maybe a whole bunch of gas stations or retailer wants to do something, but the repayment rates are based on utilization to try to make it a little more favorable if there are lower utilization rates than projected. Things like that, they're trying to make the terms. So we're trying to come at all angles here. You want to do a mega project, we got to get a lot of charging. You have a small project, we hopefully have funding for you. And then on top of it, and we just, like, I can't overstate it enough, because we keep finding that the awareness of these projects and these new stations opening, really, really key. Someone put in the chat, which is a great point, you know, there's not always great advertising or signage for EV charging stations because everybody who's using them uses an app to find the charging stations. And that's true for sure. I mean, in BC, where I'm based and worked with the provincial government for a while, there have been signage efforts, and certainly under ZEVIT, we require, as part of our merit criteria to choose projects, you know, what are you going to do for building awareness of the fact that you're opening these stations? We also we want to see your operations and maintenance plan, you know, what kind of uptime, you know, targets you're setting for yourself, et cetera. But the awareness side of things, I really think it's important for non-EV drivers for that next wave. We really still are kind of just coming out of, maybe they're just still in the early adopter phase. How do you get people aware? I think that a lot of people, like our colleague, our behavioral scientist, Vivian Lee, right now, they don't go look at the charging station locator maps because they don't have an EV. So how do they understand what's out there already and that they can drive with some confidence already in Canada? Yes, we need a lot more. But it's really not, I got our first EV in 2017, small range. I won't name any product, makes, models, etc. We still have that vehicle. And, right out of the gate, it was a revelation to us that certainly close to home, not for long travel, trips to California or anything, but it was just so easy to deal with. It was not a problem. At that time, 2017, it was far less infrastructure here. So, but I had no awareness previously to what really existed. So I think that'll just continue to be a piece of the puzzle as well. So that's maybe more than you expected me to say, Emma, but that's
no. I'm glad you're in a chatty mood because I have a question now about, you talked about the front end and what government is doing to, get more chargers out there. But on the back end, we have an audience question. Does the government of Canada intend to regulate charging rates?
I should, I'm not
Suddenly not so chatty.
designated spokesperson for the government of Canada and intentions, but I mean, I think what the question is getting into there is not the federal jurisdiction. Probably rates, electricity rates have much more to do with province set by regulators at the provincial level for electricity. That would be my initial response to that question. And we don't set rates for energy. The thing that has been talked about, and Elizabeth brought up really well, and we shared the link in the chat, is Measurement Canada regulates metrology and fair measurement and communication of measurement and what your experience is going to be at the station. So that's our area of regulation, and that's what the federal government, I'd say, really is very key and fundamental. Measurement Canada regulates, the scale at the supermarket when you're buying red peppers as well. So they anything that you're going to be pay money for that's being measured is their responsibility. So that's the area that I think we'll be regulating rates, and others who have more knowledge on the panel here about the EV charging universe might know more about it. But my guess is that falls under the tariffs and the rate structures at the provincial level by regulators. They would be the ones. I see Margarita nodding her head, so maybe that's her understanding too. City of Vancouver has its own charter, so they can probably regulate anything they want, but which is very good power to have. But I think, that's my initial response to that question.
Thanks, Chris. So David and Marga, we have a couple questions, some from me, some from the audience, that I think we can roll into a 3-for-1 here. So in terms of knowledge sharing, obviously, we have jurisdictions that have been considered early adopters, that have tried a whole bunch more things than jurisdictions that are more late to the party. We also have OEMs that have been doing this for longer and also doing EVs in more places under different rules. So with that context, is there sufficient information sharing between, Vancouver to Toronto to Halifax, from GM US to GM Canada? Either one of you can kick off this discussion, but the short question is, are you knowledge sharing between each other appropriately?
Margaret, do you want to go first, or I can jump in if you want?
Yeah, feel free to kick it off, and then I can go after. Thank you.
I mean, certainly for us across North America, of course, we're all completely aligned in our company, and we're looking very carefully at how the different jurisdictions are moving on this. I would say that right now that Canada needs to look very carefully at the new Inflation Reduction Act and the enormous degree of support from that, and also the U.S. Infrastructure Act, where through the states now we are seeing tremendous support in terms of being able to build out a charging infrastructure. And so I know Canada is looking at that very carefully. To the earlier question as well, too, I mean, we have to also be thinking very much about our electricity distribution companies. And that's not a common same type of thing. You have Quebec and British Columbia, where you can deal with tremendous utility. In Toronto, you've got a myriad of different electric companies, and we're going to see the emergence too. We talked about, one big thing that's happening now is that you're going to see the arrival of larger EVs. And so where we've seen more or less city electric vehicles up to now, where you can find a charging experience for that, to have a big battery in a big pickup truck or in an SUV, you're going to have more pressure on fast charging for those types of things. So that's really important to understand and to think about how that will be supported. But in addition to that, that will also be part of a solution, because we're going to start to see the emergence of a generator in every driveway. When you start to see large batteries in large pickup trucks and SUVs emerging, that's a backup system for our entire electric grid. And so it's not just about getting it right in terms of really good, accessible charging stations. It's going to be how you can use your vehicle as a charging station back to power your house for a week, or to perhaps power the grid and support the grid as we have needs. And we know that there are certain provinces that have fantastic low GHG power in Canada. That's a big advantage, but we're going to need more. And as that happens, we can use the new vehicles and the large batteries as part of a support network for that as well. So this gets complicated really quick. And if there's another panelist that we should have on our group here, it's probably somebody from the electric companies.
Thank you. Yeah, I can add to that. So I think in terms of sharing between cities, definitely, like, this is such a big, like, democratizing EV charging is such a big topic. And with big topic, it's obviously good to have different perspectives in. And so we do as much of that as we can. So Vancouver is part of a few networks. So the USDN, which I believe is the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, C40. We have an EV peer network between local governments. We also have a good working relationship with the province. So we're really trying our best to share solutions. And, some of those solutions might not work in Vancouver, or some of Vancouver's solutions might not work in other cities. But I think, knowledge sharing is really important. I really appreciate this panel too, just because it's not just cities that we're talking to. There's different jurisdictions, there's different groups, there's different people. And I'm learning so much today. Also, our original EV ecosystem strategy was modeled after something they were doing in Amsterdam, which was using public charging primarily to support those without home charging, which right now just seems like, well, of course. But I think like 6 years ago when we started doing that, it was this novel idea. So it's great to see how this like knowledge sharing can help, and how it can really, allow our policies in Vancouver to evolve in a nice way. So definitely very important, and hope to continue with this sort of collaborative learning moving forward.
I didn't know that Vancouver's policy was based off of Amsterdam. That's cool. So with, especially in dense urban settings, Vancouver's a great example. All the big glass towers, lots of people live in condos, MURBs, stratas across Canada. So we've gotten a couple questions about, from the audience, about how to fill this gap in, a democratic access to EV charging. So, Margaret, maybe you could just carry on a little bit and give some insights into how Vancouver at least is dealing with getting charging into older buildings that, have been around since well before the new building requirements for EV charging.
For sure. I think the main thing we have right now is the program to support EV charging in rental buildings. So we do have really great policy, like EV ready policy for new buildings. Retrofitting is, of course, a bit trickier. So with the rental building one, it's basically the building owner pays us an application fee, and then the city would install charging in the rental buildings, and we would own it, we would install it, we would pay for it, and then we would apply to BC Hydro, and they have access to provincial funding for a rebate. So it's really just trying to take the pressure off of the building owners. Of course, we put something in the policy where since we own the charging, the building owner would be paying for the electricity, and they could charge people to use the chargers. But we did put something in the policy where the building owner, the landlord, cannot pass the costs of the charger or anything on to the renter. So it's a bit protected there. And there are certain criteria on that. So like, a building would need at least 3 stalls in order to be eligible for this program and certain things like that. But we're really just trying to make it easier for these older buildings to get charging in. To complement that, we know there's a lot of older buildings in Vancouver that are condos as well, so they wouldn't be eligible for this program, but we really are trying to grow our public charging network. And we also have policies in place to encourage privately owned but publicly available charging. So it's really a multi-pronged approach. We're really taking this sort of ecosystem approach and trying to round out the network in a few different ways.
Great. And would love the rest of the panel to weigh in on this subject. It's a shameless teaser for our panel next week, which is dealing with this exact thing. But Chris, maybe I could kick it over to you because there's a question directly to you from the audience. And they're asking, is there any policy exploration underway about the way utilities download the cost to enable EV charging in MURBs, which is sort of what Margaret was just talking about, to the building owner, which in turn potentially spikes rents right when we're working to tackle affordable housing?
It's a very good question, and one that I don't have an immediate answer on the federal level too. So not to just evade the question, but I would be remiss if I sort of tried to offer some kind of answer. So that's something, when I was with the province, that was a level of conversation we were having with the BC government. So don't have a direct answer to that question, but maybe I'll just very quickly, there's been some great mention by everybody here of, looking to other jurisdictions for inspiration. And we are finding in the US, there's a lot of great stuff going on. David mentioned what's happening with the IRA and the national EV infrastructure work, really inspiring in the efforts to sort of coordinate and look at corridors and work together. Certainly, at the federal government level, we're really committed to and continuing to improve our coordination with all the players that are involved in this work. So also to better improve our tools, like we're working on various mapping tools where we can overlay all kinds of different data points to really get a better sense of where charges are needed, and then include that in future calls for proposals around infrastructure deployment. So we can say, we've done some work mapping. We see that these are areas like geographical areas or underserved areas, gaps. So on the MURB side of things, what I'd like to say about try to bring a couple pieces together here is in the US, again, we're seeing a lot of really great work on equity, that is equitable access to zero emission mobility, which doesn't necessarily mean buying a vehicle and charging your vehicle. It means access to cars through EV car sharing, for example. And just down the West Coast here in Oregon with Fourth Mobility, and in the state of California, and the organization called EV Noir, organization called the Green Lining Institute, they're doing really incredible work in the States, really progressive work on trying to include everybody, everybody in. Not everybody purchase an electric vehicle for yourself, but get access to do the things you need to do in your life, your mobility needs, which could also include e-bikes, not just necessarily cars. But that for multi-unit residential buildings in lots of neighborhoods that we're seeing in the States, they are these great car sharing programs are cropping up, and charging associated with those. So those vehicles can be shared and charged, in a way that works for those. And there's a really excellent program in California for rural communities called MioCar. And MioCar has found a way to provide access to electric vehicles in a rural setting and charging really low rates, very accessible rates. And these are some things that we're looking at federally. How could we potentially support that kind of access to vehicles for people in MURBs, but also people in more rural areas who aren't going to buy a car? Do we have the charging in place for those shared vehicles? So that's just some stuff. I can drop some links on some of those projects and programs, but they really are inspiring us to try to make sure that whole other group who are not going to be automobile purchasers have access to zero emission transportation. And a lot of them do live in MURB. So that's my tie into your question. I hope that works.
Thanks. All right. And Elizabeth and David, in the last 2 minutes, either of you want to add on thoughts to the MURB issue, which is a persistent problem with equitable access to EVs?
Elizabeth?
David, go for it.
Okay. Well, I just, again, it's a really important thing. We should be sharing great examples like Vancouver across the country and moving in that direction. We're trying to address it by at least helping build community charging level 2 charging around where people live so that they have an option and it doesn't become a barrier. We're trying to make sure that through things like we have a GM mobility program that we can help people not only to get into cars, like providing the Chevrolet Equinox EV for $35,000, that's going to be starting to get at different pay points for people as well. So bringing that out, making sure that the charging stations are accessible. We have a GM mobility program that gives people $1,000 or 2 years of OnStar. If they qualify, helps them to adapt their vehicles, ramps, handles, all kinds of things that can get people in the disabled community into an electric vehicle, help them charge at level of a wheelchair, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all things that are going to be part of this journey.
And Elizabeth, final word to you.
Yeah, sure. I think adding to the conversation on how can we assist people who are living in those multi-unit residential buildings, one of the other answers to that is curbside charging. And, you know, as David was saying, putting chargers in the communities, but also working with, you know, cities and municipalities to put in curbside chargers that people can use, you know, close to their homes or around their locations when they don't have access to, you know, home charging or a garage. The other thing that I'll throw out there that our team is always talking about is workplace charging. It's an excellent and often underutilized type of charging in that, you know, people, their cars sit there for hours during the day, so you don't necessarily need a super fast charger, and you have the time and the connection time to charge up your vehicle while you're there. So certainly something that we've seen as sort of underutilized for some employers, and could be certainly a way of helping people to charge up their vehicles where they don't have charging at home.
Thank you, everyone. I'm making Nino nervous, I can tell. We're running out of time, but really, really appreciate your expertise and, you know, coming on today. This has been such a great mix of voices and perspectives on this issue. So thank you for sharing, and I will pass it off to Nino.
Well, thanks very much, Emma, for moderating the discussion today. And I'd like to add my thanks to David, Marga, Chris, and Elizabeth. Really awesome conversation, and also to the audience as well. Fantastic questions. Sorry we didn't get to them all, but I think there was, I think you can see great engagement from the audience in the conversation, and also great to see the interaction and sharing happening on the chat between the audience. We will try and capture some of the information that's been shared there and the links that Chris shared when we publish this recording on YouTube and also on electricautonomy.ca. Big thank once again to Flow EV Charging for sponsoring today's discussion and really making it possible. Thank you very much. And on Wednesday next week, we have our 5th and final expert panel, in which we will discuss a hot topic today as well, challenges around charging in EVs in condos and MURBs. So please do register for that one. You can find the link on electricautonomy.ca. And we'll really take a deep dive on that subject with some experts working very deep in the area there. So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week.